lot of material. Yeah.
So this is kind of related, but what trends do you see when it comes to solar, wind, solar thermal projects within the United States?
Wow. What trends do I see with solar? Each of those is a whole different thing. I mean, the renewable energy field is still in its infancy. We've just started to see, and one of the interesting things in that Activity Green Business Report that we published, one of the indicators, we have about 40 indicators, and one of them is the number of clean tech patents that are issued every year. We use that as a leading indicator of innovation. And we break it down by technology. And as fast as solar is growing, there are 400 or 500 new patents every year on solar technologies. And that means that we have not yet run out all the inefficiencies. This is just starting to ramp, and we're going to be seeing a lot more in all these technologies, solar, wind, and everything else. I think the interesting part is that we're going to a decentralized world, not just with energy, but with food and so many other things. Think about, actually most of this has happened before you got, well, here's the history of computers in the last 50 years in under 30 seconds, 45 seconds, right? Started with big mainframe computers and a bunch of dumb terminals, right, that could only pull information from the mainframe. And I'm going to get to your answer in a second. And over time, those terminals got smarter and more independent and better able to do things in and of themselves and not just take information from the mainframe. And then they were able to talk to each other as part of this network, and then they were able to talk to just about everything that we have that is a computer and can talk to other computers, and it happened wirelessly. 38 seconds. And all that happened because of incredible advances in disk processing and disk storage and microprocessing speed and wireless bandwidth and all that, to the point where information, data, became so cheap and ubiquitous that it's essentially free. That we don't really think about how much time we spend doing this or doing this or doing this, right? It's kind of free. I mean, we pay something, but we're not metered by the minute or anything like that. So, the local power plant that provides power for Flagstaff, that's your mainframe. And this wonderful building, and I mean no disrespect, is one of the dumb terminals. Right? It can just take information in the form of electricity from the mainframe. Now, over time, these terminals are going to become smarter and more self-sufficient, able to make their own energy and able to have a conversation with the other terminals, the other buildings around here. And eventually, some of that will happen wirelessly. And so the question and the opportunity is, how do we make energy so cheap and ubiquitous that it's almost free, that we don't think about it? And how do we do that, decarbonize it along the way by making it renewable? That's a fundamentally different question than most of what's being asked. That's 180 degrees from drill, baby, drill, right? Which is about energy scarcity, energy. We've got more and more, we need more and more to make, just to maintain the status quo. This is a fundamental rethinking of this. It's a distributed world where everything is both a user and a producer of energy. That's a whole different world. So that's where it's going. That's the long answer to your short question. That all these technologies are continually going to change, but more than the technologies themselves, they're getting integrated, embedded with intelligence, and the buildings and the things that they're powering are going to get embedded with utility. We're seeing wearables now and glasses, and pretty soon our garments will be solar collectors. They'll just be embedded in textiles, and we'll be able to charge everything that's on us, and who knows what else, and who knows what else will be even on us at the point that we'll need charging. But there will be more things, and it's just going to become part of our lives, where the idea that we plug in something and that we get a bill and based on how many kilowatt hours we use at the end of the month, someday will be an anachronism. It will just be the same way that we don't think about I used to get a bill that said how many minutes you're online. And so that's where the world's going. It's pretty exciting, and I think it's going to take a good chunk of your guys' careers to get us there.
Do you have any thoughts on the whole phosphorus sustainability issue? Because
the what? I'm sorry.
The phosphorus, like the fact that we source of the plant that we get so much from, and it's depleting at a rapid rate?
I don't know a lot about phosphorus, but I do know that there are many things that you could substitute in that sentence that are things that there's a limited supply and may be controlled by 1 or 2 or 3 countries, and there may be countries that are not that friendly to us or not that stable in the world, that and that there's less and less of it to do more and more things. There are a lot of those kinds of things. There's something called rare earths that are in renewable energy, electric cars, and a lot of other things, and China controls most of it, 70, 80, maybe even higher percentage. And that's where our world is working. And so we're going to be having resource wars. It may not be over something like phosphorus, probably be over things like water, but it may be over other. We've already seen it over oil. But we don't know what it'll be over. Maybe food related. But that's I think those challenges of how do we look at those resources and how do we design around them? How do we can there's 2 ways to deal. You can create more or use less. And sometimes you can't create more. We can't create more oil. Well, you can by drilling more, but there's a finite amount. It becomes more and more expensive to get that oil. But those are the interesting challenges. How do we innovate our way around constraints? Is already, the whole renewable energy market is based on that question. A lot of the stress nexus things I talked about are around that. A lot of smart cities. How do we bring people together in confined spaces and have them live together well and get what they need and not have to live in the suburbs where they have to drive and end up in gridlock and it's not even that happy for them in the first place. How do we design around those constraints? Huge opportunities.
I feel like that this is a very different lecture about being green than what you would have heard in, say, like the 1990s or the 80s or even earlier. It's a very different story. So do you think that going green is an inevitable evolution of economies, and that we are moving there, and it's kind of like the only way to survive?
Well, the things we buy today are greener than they used to be, whether we like it or not, because companies have been systematically bringing out the waste and inefficiency and resource intensity of everything. And it's for largely economic reasons, but also because it does reduce risk and the footprints, the environmental, ecological footprints. So they're not marketing it, and they shouldn't. It's just the way business is being done. But a lot of things around that being more environmentally responsible, they shouldn't talk about. It's just the way things are being done now. That companies need to understand their footprint. They need to understand what the biggest part of what they do that relates to pollution or emissions or natural capital. And so that's become part of the fabric, and that has changed and grown year over year, or certainly every few years over time. So that is inevitable. I think there's some bigger leaps that need to happen, and the question is, will that happen because of a crisis? We hit a wall, and all of a sudden they don't have it anymore. We're just running out of water. They realize that, and there's this huge movement to make everything more water efficient, and farming goes through a revolution, and whatever resource it happens to be, or is it just part of a slow, gradual innovation process? But yeah, I think companies realize that for all the reasons I explained around risk, that particularly around risk, that they need to change, and so that part is inevitable. The questions are who leads and who follows, and who eats whose lunch, and what new business opportunities are created along the way. Did that get to your question? Okay, you have there, and there.
So I'm of the belief that innovation in sustainability is driven by scarcity and supply. We've seen in the 1700s when Thomas Malthus said that at 7 billion population mark, basically the human population will not be able to sustain itself because we won't have enough food to supply. And we hit that point in half. In the 1980s, they said by 2020 we're going to be out of fossil fuels. Just recently, by 2050 we're going to be out of fresh water. So I'm of this belief that if there's a scarcity in supply that can be demonstrated, then there's this exponential growth in development of sustainable energies. But I think that, at least in my opinion, and from some of the studies I've seen, if you take the entire Earth's population and you can fit them into Texas, and the density of that population will be less than New York City. So I think that like when we look at these green technologies, my simple perspective is that it's more of a marketing play. That yes, companies are doing things, but we've seen through the past that we really don't innovate unless there's a need. When gas prices went up, we saw this huge growth in sustainable vehicles, hybrids, Prius, etc. But now gas prices are going down, and we don't necessarily see a huge trend in these vehicles. So do you think that that we're going to have some type of logarithmic growth, or do you think it's going to be a different kind of growth pattern on these sustainable energies and corporates adopting corporate social responsibility?
So I have two things to say about that, two different streams, if you don't mind. One is that resource constraints are part of the reason that companies innovate, but they innovate partly because they create something better. So Steve Jobs did not create iTunes because the world was running out of polycarbonates to make CDs, right? There was a better technology that happens to have huge dematerialization, packaging, materials, energy, the shipping, and all that. But it's a better technology. And when you look at digital technology, dematerialized mail and so many other things, catalogs and all sorts of things that used to be around. And books, what's a bookstore, right? Those are better, those are driven by shortages of paper or shortages of anything else. Those are driven by innovation, better technology. So that's going to continue, and that will continue. I think this whole Malthusian thing, I mean, there are people who can take this on far more eloquently than I, but I think that whole thing that we will always find innovative ways to address whatever challenges, population or resource challenges that we have, works to an extent, and here's the wild card, it's called climate, that we are hitting a wall of what, and it's not a theoretical wall, we're seeing it now, of how much carbon we can put, and other things we put into the atmosphere, and what that does in terms of changing the amount of water, where it's available, when it's available, how much one big time or not at all, and a number of other things, and how that's going to affect food and other kinds of things. If climate wasn't an issue, I would be much more inclined to say, yeah, we'll figure it out. They've always figured it out, and we'll keep figuring it out. But that's the wild card, and that's where I think we're seeing the signs now. Climate is, it's not a scientific debate; it's a political debate, and that's changing the equation hugely. And so I think that we don't know, in a world where we can't predict what the climate's going to be anymore. We don't know how we're going to have food, and let alone 30, 40, 50% more food, energy, and water. We're in a world where if we could make coal-powered plants and keep spewing that stuff forever, and it wasn't making people sick, that would be we can do that for another century or two or three, natural gas and everything else. But we're hitting walls on all that, and that's the challenge, and that's where I think most, certainly scientists, but I think a lot of savvy business people, business leaders, see that that's, we're not going to we can't completely innovate ourselves out of that. Or is it you? One of you and then here. Yes.
So in the beginning you said that you would be differentiating your sustainability of environmental specific from social and economic. But I saw much more convergence with differentiation. Why do you differentiate? Where do you see?
Well, I guess I was apologizing for the fact that I was going to be mostly talking about the environmental sustainability, even though I was going to be using the S word a lot. And in our State of Green Business Report, we did talk about 10 trends, and one of them is that the social factors started to come back in because we, society, is recognizing, in business society in particular, is that this is ultimately about people and lives. And we talk commerce, we can talk return on investments and all kinds of metrics and stock prices. But this is really about people, whether the people who work for us or the people who buy our stuff, and their ability to do that. Whether you can't have a healthy company in an unhealthy community or a healthy environment. And so that was what my, but this is, and there are huge issues. Because I didn't talk about income inequality. We didn't talk about human rights. We didn't talk about the role of women. We didn't talk about a lot of issues that fall under the sustainability rubric. Those I focus on the environmental piece of that. So I really was saying we're not going to cover it all, even though I'm going to use that word. I think we have time for one, maybe two more.
I'm interested to hear how you've seen sustainable business practices influence attitudes and practices in the general public and in the government sectors as well.
In other words, is there other green consumers who are?
I guess in business has an opportunity to innovate sometimes. I think in the world of sustainability, maybe ahead of the curve, especially in the absence of government action, like our federal government action in climate policy. And I'm curious if you've seen business practices have an influence on public behaviors and attitudes. It's hard to directly link, perhaps, but how you've seen that relationship.
I'm not trying to answer that. I mean, I think business community is way ahead of the public, the consuming public. Because most of us are still grappling with, which bin to put things in, right? I mean, it's hard, it's confusing, and to the point of, so the iTeens example, green or sustainability works only to the extent that it equals better. Now, depends what it is, and we could better, cheaper to buy, cheaper to operate, longer lasting, locally sourced, renewable, cooler for my image, healthier for my family, depends what it is. And we could take any one product and 30 of us could come up with 100 definitions of better. But for consumers, a lot of things have not been better. They've been more expensive or harder to use, or to buy them from someplace where brand you didn't know and trust. And so that's one of the big challenges. So I think companies, as I said a few minutes ago, that a lot of that stuff is greener in spite of ourselves, not because we're demanding it, but because companies are doing this as a matter of that's how you do business now. That's how you remain competitive. I wrote a book called The Green Consumer in 1990. I realized in retrospect that there may have been a reason that it was called The Green Consumer. There was not a huge appetite for the public to make changes. But I do think that more so than products, people, maybe many of you, want to get behind brands and companies that you believe in. And I think that's, and that's a hard thing to do because of all the reasons that I talked about, why companies don't like to talk about these things. But I think there are companies that are, Nike is a good example, Levi's, and a few others that are finding their way through that sort of landmine about creating a brand image that is about responsible, and they're a quote-unquote good company. And I think that's where, companies are challenged and trying to do this, and not many are succeeding. I'm not sure to answer your question about government, but we're going to run out of time. I think we've got one more question, and then we'll take the rest of it outside.
Quick clarification. Did I understand your explanation for the plateauing is that companies are taking the old mindset of a business case as well as a more systemic mindset of risk factors? Did I get that right?
So why is the progress plateauing, and is it because of this old set of, I didn't even imply that because of some old set of assumptions as opposed to risk factors. I think progress is plateauing because, in the good old slogan, companies have picked the low-hanging fruit. They've done the easy stuff. And, they've switched out the lights, for example, and put LEDs for those exit lights, and things that earn out pretty, within a year or two or three, and fairly easy to do, don't require big changes. And now's the time for the harder stuff. And it's what's harder. And companies are trying to figure out what that is, and how do they afford it, and where does that fit with all the other things that they have to be thinking about on a daily basis. And we're about to have a 3-day conference in Scottsdale, our Green Business Forum, that's going to be looking at this, talking about, and the theme is getting further faster. How do we get past the swapping out the light bulbs and really get into what is that next layer of stuff? We're going to have 300 or 400 sustainability executives from 300 or 400 of the world's biggest companies talking about this and sharing what they're knowing. And so it'll be an interesting conversation. Talk to me Thursday. I'll tell you more. Thanks again. Be out. She's the reason I'm here.
Well, many people are the reason that Joel's here, and I'm really glad I asked Susan to go on this journey with me. Thank you very much to the business school for hosting us. We have lots of other sponsors today this evening. We wanted to thank the Green Fund, Northern Arizona Center for Emerging Technology, the Center for International Education at NAU, Economic Collaborative of Northern Arizona, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Environmental Caucus, the Sustainable Economic Development Initiative, and the Sustainable Communities Master Program. So lots of good people in our community doing some really great things. We hope that you'll go upstairs, join us for the reception, an opportunity to visit more with Joel.